All right. Well, welcome to this is the fourth week for the class, and you'll see I'm in England right now, so I'm joining you here from the Cotswolds, so in Stroud, and so hopefully you can all hear me, and the internet will stay functional. So, does anybody have any questions on what you've reviewed so far? Because I want to give you that opportunity. If we have a question specifically, I want you to go ahead and we'll address that before we jump into the things I think you might have questions on. So, anybody have something at the moment? You guys are also quiet and polite. So, all right. Okay, so chapter 6, this week it's chapter 6 and 7. So that's really kind of where you should be to. And I know that the online version is slightly different at the moment, and we're updating it. We're in the process of updating the online to match the new format of the ninth edition book. So by the time you get to chapter 7, really 1 through 6, it's all the same, right? The structure is. But one of the comments we used to get is chapter 5 and chapter 7 were getting to be these monster chapters. And so what we did is we split them up into a couple of different chapters and just reorganized stuff. So now your book, chapter 7, is only the array and the inverters, and then we'll talk about other issues in other chapters. So that's why you're going to get a little bit off kilter. If that causes you a bit of problems as you're studying, let me know. I'll make sure you get a PDF of the 8th edition that tracks right in line. But, I think it's sort of neither here nor there. It's all the same material. And the ninth actually has a little bit more material. Yeah, Aaron, you had a question?
I ran into some challenges in chapter 5 with the battery information. It seemed like that was in chapter 9, I
Yeah.
think.
Yeah,
Okay,
we
just
moved it to its own chapter. That
okay.
was one of those things
I
because
like
chapter
that.
5 was getting long. And
Yeah,
so we said, all right, what can we pull out of this and put into another area,
yeah.
just to focus on that.
Full
So,
disclosure, I'm a week behind because yeah, chapter 5 like really kind of stuck it to me. And I had
yeah.
a wedding in the family, so that's why
Wait till
I'm
you,
kind of I usually ask a lot of questions, but I'm
sure.
a little off on it.
Okay. Well, once you get to chapter 7, you're going to think chapter 5 was a dawdle, So,
Oh, nice.
yeah, chapter 7, that's the one that everybody freaks out, because
I've been looking at. Yeah.
that's when you start getting into the math. So in fact, that's what I was going to review a little bit here today is some of the math from chapter 7. But I just thought as chapter 6 to me, which is the site assessment chapter, to me is pretty intuitive. Some of this stuff is stuff that you just have no experience with. You're learning a new language. You're like, okay, VOC. Nobody's born knowing what VMP and VOC and ISC and all of these terminologies are. But when you talk about, okay, I want to do a site assessment, well, it's pretty logical. You say, okay, where do you want the solar panels? Do you want it on your roof? Do you want it in your backyard? What direction should we face it? How do we orient it? The angles, so you get azimuth, you get altitude, and all of that's going to make a bit of a difference. You talk about safety in the process. Where are you going to store these things? Because if you heard talking with Jimmy there, who's with Justin in the car, Jimmy's out doing solar installations. Well, there's a lot of issues that you run into. Like he was just saying, as before we started, you go to do a remote site assessment for a building, and I like to use a program called Open Solar because it's free. I'm cheap, and so I wanted to use Open Solar. It's one that you can go in. It uses data from Google Earth, and you can simply go and it shows you the rooftop, and you say, this is the panel I'm using, and you lay it out, and it knows the size of the panel. It knows the size of the roof. It allows you to fit the panels on there. If they don't fit, you know that they won't fit. It tells you the orientation. It's got a lot of functionality, but it relies on data from Google Earth. And a lot of times I'll go out there and look at a site, somebody, and it's built 3 years ago, and you go to Google Earth and it's a field. There's no building there. Well, how are you going to lay out your panels on a roof when there's nothing there? So in that case, What we were talking about is you go out with a drone, you send the drone up, you can take a snapshot, and then you can import that into the program. So, it's obviously a multiple step, and sometimes you don't even have to do that. But if you're doing a proposal, you're going to want it to look professional. So there's a lot of those kind of things when the product starts arriving. Oftentimes you want the product to be there on site. So where are you going to store it? If you're getting 30 solar panels, well, that's a big pallet of solar panels. Where are those going to go? Are they going to sit in the driveway? Are they going to go in a garage? If there's a swimming pool or something, or if you want to bring in one of those cherry pickers to bring everything up onto the road, can you get it up next to the building? Are there trees that you have to navigate? Are there neighbors' dogs? How are you going to run the conduit? Is there a terrible neighbor next door? This is something you run into. Like in Florida, we had a woman who lived next door who kept calling the police on us because my wife's typing was bothering her dog. Typing on a manual typewriter, and or bouncing a ball outside. So whatever, it's crazy. People are crazy. So so all of that stuff you can sort of makes intuitive sense. One little thing I would suggest if you do go out and start to do this for a living, if you're going to a site, doing a site assessment, you sign the contract, you're going to go, you've set up your timeline, and you've said, okay, we're going to be there on October 14th for the install. I really suggest you go to the next door neighbors, go, one or two doors down, maybe across the street, and say, hey, you know what, Mr. and Mrs. Jones here, we've just signed a contract to do solar installation. We want to be aware that this is your neighborhood. Is there something we should be aware of? Is there a parking area that you don't want us to park in? Because we don't want you calling the cops on us. You don't tell them that, but we don't want you calling the police because we parked in your chosen parking space or whatever. And at the same time, maybe sell them. You can say, hey, we're going to be here. If you want, we can put you into the next day. We'll give you a 5% discount, a 10% discount, whatever, because our people are already here. If you're interested, if not, fine. Just tell us if there's an issue. Maybe I work nights, so I'm trying to sleep during the day. Is there any way you can keep the noise down? So all of that kind of stuff. So that's just all very intuitive. So I don't think there's anything in chapter 6 that I necessarily have to highlight, but you certainly need to be aware of it. So the chapter 7, we really start talking about, there are a few concepts there. One, of course, that you're going to do all the time is sizing an array, and this thing drives me crazy where folks will all the time come and say, how much does a solar array cost? How much does solar cost? And that's like saying, how much does a house cost? Or, how much does a car cost? Say, well, there's a lot of factors here. Is it in New York City or is it in Chauncey? There are two different prices here going on. Is it a McMansion or is it a double wide? So with solar, the very first thing you need to know is, what are you looking to power? What's the load? Living in Athens, I always thought every first line when you go into a bar, what's your major? That kind of thing. Well, this is the what's your major? This is what's the load? What's the load? So where do you get load information? Well, if it's a standalone system, then you may have to just do a load analysis. So that's in the book. You just say, what are all the appliances I want to run? How long am I going to run them? How much power do they use? And then you just do a spreadsheet. And that's what we're going to end up with. But 9 times out of 10, it's going to be somebody living in an existing home and they want to install solar. Well, that's easy. What's their load? Just give me a copy of your electric bill. That's your load. So that's your first stop. Whenever somebody asks you about solar, you just say, all right, I need to see a copy of your electric bill. And that gives you a lot of information because those electric bills typically have 12 months worth of usage. So you can look at their usage pattern. You can see if it's changing, if it's, how it's working. And you're going to plug that into your online design software. You could either just do an annual and then average it, or plug in month to month to month. And then of course you want to ask the person some questions like, do you anticipate your load going up? You know, that may be something that they don't even think about, but some of the questions you're going to want to say is, are you thinking about maybe buying an electric car? If you're thinking about that, then that's going to have a significant impact on your load. Um, do you have a teenage kid who's going off to college? That might cut their electric use in half. You know, it's like we raised our granddaughter. We used to call her Miss America because she was 1 out of 3 population, but used 90% of the resources. You know, so she was America in a nutshell. So when they move out, maybe you begin to save on it. But normally people use more and more power over time, not less and less. I think we mentioned last time, if you're designing for a roof, it's a good idea to future proof and say, what's the maximum number of panels that would fit on this roof? And then let's design the wire and let's design the conduit and the disconnects and all of that to handle the maximum. You know, we're only going to install what they need up top. But if the roof could hold 30 panels and you're only putting in 20, why not put in the bigger wire? Put in the bigger disconnects. It's going to save you a little, you know, it's going to cost a little bit of money, a couple $100, but it's going to save you thousands if they decide in 2 years, oh, I think I'm going to want more. And at that point, it's easy. It's easy peasy to just go in there and add a few panels, add a rack. So future proof that. The downside there is make sure they know that that's what you're doing. Because if you're competitive bidding, you're coming in more expensive because you're doing a better job for them. So they might require or ask you to give them 2 bids and say, here's the bare minimum bid, which is probably what you're getting from other people. And here's what I would recommend because yeah, it's going to be $600 more, but it's going to give you this flexibility. And some people are very price sensitive and they may come back and say, no, you know, I want the cheapest. So, you know, at least you've given them both options. Putting together one of those bids is not that hard. So, okay, so let's talk a little bit about sizing an array. I'm going to go to the whiteboard here. Go. All right, so when we're talking about the sizing of the array, the first thing you need to know is what's their load. And so you look at their electric bill, and the average US homeowner uses on average about 900 kilowatt hours. It's 890 and some change, I think now. It's been going down consistently a little bit over recent years. That's because of energy efficiencies, energy appliances, LED lights, things like that. So we've gone from about, say, 920 kilowatt hours down to about 890 on average. So that's just for a typical suburban home. So that just gives you a slight rough rule of thumb. So let's just say this person, they're using 790 kilowatt hours per month. Well, you want to get to their daily load. So we'll just simply take that, and I like to use 30.5 days per month. I mean, you could use 30, you could use 31, but 30.5, I think, gives me a little bit tighter number. And so I'm going to have to go to my calculator here because I can't do it in my head. And 790 divided by 30.5 gives me 25.9. So their daily load, 25.9 kilowatt hours per day. Well, why are we going daily load? It's, you know, the sun rises and sets on a daily basis. Hopefully that's not news to you. So that's what we do. I mean, we're talking about how much sun are we getting in a day? How much power are we using in a day? Well, then the next thing is how much sun are you getting? Well, this could be complicated, but I'm going to stop the share here. Yeah, I stopped that. And then I'm going to go into, hopefully, oh, maybe I've got to share that and then reduce the screen. My whiteboard. You guys are probably still seeing the whiteboard, right? Yeah. If I do this, you cannot minimize. Okay. All right. I'll stop. I was hoping to go into PV watts. Are you by chance seeing PV watts on the screen? No. Okay. All right. Now maybe I can do it. Docs. Oh, there's screens. Okay, there we go. Okay. Really? Okay, I think I'm there. Do you see PV watts now? All
Yeah.
right, great. Okay, so let's just say we want to do this in Athens, Ohio, because that's where you guys are, some of you. So I'm going to just type in Athens, Ohio. You could type in 45701, whatever. You can do a zip code. And then it's going to just confirm you go down here to a Google Maps and just make sure you're in the right spot. Because it might, if you typed in Athens, it might take you to Athens, Georgia, or whatever. So just make sure you're in the right spot. Then we're going to say go to the system. And now it always defaults here to 4 kilowatts as size. It has standard module. You can, if you already know the size of your array, but at this point we're determining it. So you may as well just leave it at 4. Standard module type, you can say thin film, you can say premium, just leave it at standard. Fixed open rack, or if you know it's a roof mounted, you'll just say fixed roof mounted. Here's your system losses. We don't have to worry about that at the moment, but we'll touch on that later. How do you calculate your system losses? Well, I'll touch on it since I've got this. This has a nice little tool to help you to sort of remind you about the things that cause loss. Soiling, they put in a 2% default. Soiling is basically dust, pollen. Over time, that's going to reduce the amount of power that your solar array is generating. You can fix that by, say, once a year going out there with a soft sponge and some dishwashing detergent and just washing your panels. Rain will take care of most of it, but it'll take care of dust for the most part. But pollen can be a little bit sticky. So you might, if it's a ground mounted system, it's easy. If it's a roof mounted system, it might not be worth the bother. So, that's kind of up to you. Most people don't mess with it. Maybe when they first install it, they get real eager about it. It's like washing a new car, and eventually you're like, yeah, let it be dirty. So, that's just normal human. Shading, well, if you've picked a place with no shade, very easy to just say, okay, let's make that 0 because I don't have a shading issue. But shading, ideally, that's one of the things you can control. Snow, what's proportion? No, people ask me this a lot. Do I have to clean the snow off my solar array? In a place like Southern Ohio, not really. We don't get that much snow anymore. When you do get snow, it's usually pretty dreary, so you're not generating much power anyway. And as soon as the sun comes out, that snow pretty much melts off those black solar panels. So as soon as the edge of it is seeing, then it melts quickly. It comes off. If it's a ground mounted system, I bought one of those long pole trucker windshield cleaner things, and you can go out there with that. Make sure it's rubber and not metal because you don't want to scratch the panels. And you can do it, but then you start calculating the amount of time it took you versus the amount of money in electricity you just saved. And you're going to be paid about 30 cents an hour for your work. So at that point, you just go, you know what, I'll just let it melt. So panel mismatch. What we're dealing with on some of these is if you have a string inverter, every panel is going to behave like the worst panel in the array. If everything is connected together in a typical string system and in a combiner box and then into your inverter. So if you have panels that have performance and they say plus or minus 2%, basically that's minus 2% because whatever the worst one is, it's going to dictate how things behave. That's one of the beauties of things like microinverters or power optimizers is each one works independently of every other one. So if it's plus or minus 2%, then it's zero, right? Because you get one that's a little more, one that's a little less, and nobody cares. So in this case, we're just assuming we've got a string inverter. The wiring, that's voltage drop. We want to keep that at 2% or less, ideally. So voltage drop is voltage drop. You're going to have some. So leave that at, say, 2%. Connections, they're putting in 0.5%. So every time you're making a connection, there's a little bit of loss due to resistance. So leave it at 0.5%, not bad. Light-induced degradation. This is called LID. This is sort of, I like to just say it's like new car smell. As soon as you get it, as soon as you drive the car off the lot, you lose some money on it. Well, with solar panels, as soon as you put them out into the sun, in that first week or two, they're going to lose some production. It's a one-time loss, So in this case, they're just saying you're losing 1.5%. Yeah, you can factor that in if you want. I hate to do it because it's assuming it's forever, but it is just a one-time loss. So I usually leave it out. Nameplate rating, okay, they've said that. That's just, assuming that the panel may not produce what it says it's going to produce. Oftentimes in modern panels, though, they used to always say plus or minus 2%. Now they say plus 2%. There's no minus. They're basically saying we're guaranteeing this thing's going to produce what the nameplate says. It might produce a little bit more. So that's pretty typical in today's market. And then availability, this is one that I just always leave off because they're basically saying your solar panels aren't working all the time. Sometimes you turn them off because there's maintenance, or sometimes there's a problem or whatever. Well, it seems to me 3% during the year is a lot of problems. So I just, they're like, let's not even anticipate that. We're talking about full production all the time. So let's just lower that down. So at this point, we're coming in, and I don't know where they get this 8.68% because it should be about 8.5% there. But anyway, you can play with this, or you can just do it in your head. But that's called derating, right? It's saying, okay, there's going to be efficiencies in every system. How do we derate that? And PV Watts has a nice little tool to help you with that. The reality is if you're installing multiple systems over time and you're doing the same one over and over, which tends to be the way that people operate, is because once you find a product you like, you end up selling it to the next one and the next one and the next one, because they're relying on your expertise, they're relying on your recommendations, and you're going to install one that you didn't have any problems with. So now you know how to do it. You're better at estimating the time. You remember how to put the thing together. It's like anything that you do. The first one you do might take you 5 hours. The second time you do the same thing, it takes you an hour. So we tend to go towards the same. Then we want to say, okay, what's the altitude, the tilt of the roof? Well, if it's a roof-mounted system, the tilt of the roof is what the roof is. You're not going to be able to adjust that. But that's 20 is what they defaulted at. You can take your phone when you're on a site assessment and just lay it on the roof. They have apps that'll tell you what the angle is. So that's a nice way of measuring it. You just sit the phone right there and it says 22 degrees or whatever it is. Often they'll tell you it's a 412 pitch. You can look at the table in your book and figure out what that angle is. So you can do it that way. Azimuth is it facing solar south? That's 180. If it's facing east, it's 90. If it's west, it's 270. If it's north, it's 0. So that's just how you measure that. 180 is ideal, but very rarely is your building going to be facing perfectly 180. You can get that from a program like Open Solar. As soon as you pull up the thing, it's going to tell you what is the azimuth of that building, because it's just going to measure that. Or you can get an app for your phone if you're on the site, but you may not be facing it, exactly. Zane State's being annoying here. All right, let me turn off my email and that'll stop. Okay, so those are some of the things. So I'm gonna I'll show you that if it's tilt of 20 and 180, now we go in here and it's gonna tell me the amount of sunlight. Notice here, it's telling me that the hours of insolation. And it says in Athens, Ohio, on average, with those parameters, you're getting 4.48 hours of insolation. That basically means 4.48 chunks of 1,000 watt per square meter sunlight. Doesn't mean it's only sunlight for 4.5 hours and the rest of the day it's dark. It just means that those are the chunks. So 4,480 watts of power, watt hours of power hit that square meter over the course of the day. So we divide it into units of 1,000. Why units of 1,000? Because that's what standard test conditions are. So you'll see why this comes into play. We want to convert sunlight to hours. So we're getting 4.48 hours of perfect sunlight in Athens, Ohio, given those orientations. If I change the orientation, so just remember it was 4.48. Let's say if this is facing east, well, now I go back and it's only 3.89. So we just lost about 20% of our power, which we would expect because that's the difference between east and south. Or if it's still south, but instead of 20-degree pitch, let's say it's 40-degree pitch, well, it's not going to be 4.48. It's better, actually, 4.55. So over the course of the year, it actually did a little bit better, being a little bit higher pitch in that place, which surprises me. But, now I'll bet you if I make it 60, it's going to be less for sure. 4.2, yeah. So the further north you go, the more you want that angle to be more vertical, so latitude, you guys in Athens are at 39 degrees north latitude, which is why they named the restaurant there in, what is that, Baker Center, right? Isn't there a restaurant there at 39 north latitude or something like that? Anyway, I-70 is right about 40 degrees north latitude, if you follow that along so anyway, so this is what you can do. This tool is very, very handy. You'll use it all the time. So we already know, let's assume that we're doing this and it's 20 degrees, or I'll make it 25 just for a little bit of variety. All right, so we're 4.54. Okay, so that's going to be our number. So I'm going to go back to the whiteboard. Okay, and we're back here. Hopefully you're seeing the whiteboard. Well, now I knew that my daily load was 29.9. Well, now I have 4.54 hours per day of sunlight. Well, the hours per day cancel out. So 29.9 divided by 4.54 is, divided by 4.54, 5.7. Okay, so 5.7, what? It's kW. So that's why the hours per day canceling out. So if this system were 100% efficient, I would need a 5.7 kW array to generate 790 kilowatt hours per month at that location under those circumstances that we plugged in, which was 25 degrees altitude, 180 degrees azimuth. Is everybody with me so far?
Mm-hmm.
All right. But it's not going to be 100% efficient. So now I have to divide it by the efficiency of the system. Well, we went through that whole D-rate process, and we decided with this array, it's about 8.5% inefficient, which would mean that it's about 91.5% efficient. So the D rate factor is going to be 0.915. That's just 91.5% decimalized. So at this point, you divide. So I'm taking 5.7 divided by 0.915, and I get 6.24, say 6.24. So the array that we need to install, given everything that we factored in, we need a 6.24 kW array. That's it. They're really just three steps with this process. You take the monthly, well, you get your daily load, you divide it by the hours of insolation, and then you divide it by the D rate factor. That's pretty much it. So I really feel like sizing the array is a pretty straightforward process. Usually with this math, the problem is not knowing where to start. So what I'll always do is, if you know you start with your daily load, which is going to be in kilowatt hours per day, and we need to get to kilowatts, which is where our ending point is, the size of the array. What do? We divide by hours per day. Okay, well, that's not 24, it's hours of sunlight. And then that gives us the size of our array if it were 100% efficient, which it's not. So we divide that by the D rate and we get the answer. Now, if you end up with 5.7 kW and then you multiply it times the D rate, which is something people do a lot, and you'll get a smaller number, well, logically, that should make sense, right? If everything was great, I need 5.7, but because I lose some of the power, I can get by with a smaller array. Yeah, that's just all backwards. So hopefully you'll realize that as you're working the numbers. So, all right. So everybody cool about this one?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I'm gonna clear the
I have a
page.
quick question.
Sure, go ahead.
I understand the math, but does the PV watts not do it doesn't do the efficiency and the inefficiency. It just helps you figure it out so that you know
Right.
how. Okay.
Yeah, well, there's another function that PV Watts can do, which we're not talking about at the moment, where it does factor that in. And
Oh,
that's
okay.
when it tells you about how much energy that system is going to generate over the course of a year. So,
Mm,
then it starts looking about efficiency. And for whatever reason, they put the inverter inefficiency in a different location. I don't know why they don't put that in the D rate, but that's separately identified within when you go to the advanced parameters, and they have a place there that says, okay, plug in the efficiency of the inverter. Because in my way of thinking, the things that I always think about primarily when I'm talking about D rate is voltage drop is number one. That's going to be hopefully 2%. You can control that. The inverter inefficiency, that's a big one. And oftentimes these inverters, they'll say they're 98% efficient or 97% efficient. Well, that means they're 2 or 3% inefficient. So that's a number that gets added into it. And then the third one will be, I'll usually say, okay, 0.5% for connections, and there's going to be some other intangibles. I rarely use string inverters anymore, so I don't have to worry about mismatch panels. We'll use either microinverters or optimizers, so all of that goes away. You can put in aging if you want. You're going to lose about 0.5% a year. So normally I suggest that you be generous in your D rate, because you want to under promise and over deliver. So when you're
yeah.
doing this proposal to a customer and you say, okay, this is the amount of power you're going to get over the course of a year, and you come up ahead of that, they think you're a great installer. If you come up behind that, they think you're a crap installer. And really, it's just you were trying to be too tight on the D rate.
I was about to say that I've had an experience with somebody asking about, like, they said, well, the installer said that it was going to be this savings and it's not touching that. And I feel like that's probably where the challenge lies, right? They probably, perhaps, there's a lot of things
Yeah. I would
It's
say there's a lot of shysters out there who are over promising. They're given, yeah, I mean, I've seen some proposals that you just shake your head and say, that's just physically not possible. I mean, that's just, these guys are just, they're feeding you a line hoping to sign because the way that the business is set up, if someone, my advice to people is they say, somebody knocked on my door and was trying to sell me a solar plan. What should I do? And I say, well, slam the door in their face and tell them to go away because don't ever buy anything from someone who's knocking on your door. I mean,
I don't care what they're selling.
yeah, it doesn't matter. And so a lot of times they've got these guys who are cold calling, selling a system, then they turn it over and it goes to another company and then they sub it out to somebody else. And really it's like, I'll tell you anything you want to hear to get you to sign this thing, especially if it's one of these power purchase agreements or you're renting the system. And it
I
can be
think there
really
was someone like that in our neighborhood just recently. It, Justin, are you Murphy Brothers? I missed the beginning of the last class. Are you guys Murphy Brothers?
Who, me?
Yeah.
No, no, no.
Okay. I was gonna
Clean energy solar.
awesome. Thanks.
yeah.
Sorry. All right.
Where
Uh,
Murphy, yeah, Murphy is Clean Energy and Murphy are two Marietta based.
I
So
just heard Marietta, and to be clear, Murphy Brothers are not the people that were going door to
yeah,
door. I just
yeah,
thought I made the connection.
yeah. I haven't heard anything negative about Murphy, and of course I know Clean Energy and they're great. So
Yeah.
so yeah, but there are a lot of those, like some of the notorious ones like Pink Solar, and they're just all of these. There's a pattern that they follow and they use scouts to go out there and get the contracts and then they sell them. It's a mess.
Sorry to
and
tell.
Tesla's
We do
I
get
heard,
asked a lot. We get asked, about those types of things. Like we're getting ready to go to the Paw Paw Festival,
yeah,
and we get asked those types of
I would
things.
categorize those folks as lead generators. A lot of them that don't have a local crew.
yeah,
So often they're farming the work out that Jay just described in the best case scenario to a local competent crew and marking it up, which frustrates the local crews. As you can understand, they'd rather be offering more competitive pricing directly. The other thing I'd flag for you, Aaron, too, just as it relates to the SOPEC folks in the call, and this is a market influence we've had, where we've been successful at beating the market. It has altered the payback period for some systems,
Mm.
especially on the commercial PPA side. And so it's nothing that anybody's doing wrong on their side or ours, but if we have really competitive pricing and it drops back the price of power that they're offsetting, then sometimes that can extend the payback period. So that's just a function of markets.
yep. And of course, we're talking about with these payback periods, 7, 10 years, somewhere in there, and the price of electricity can change dramatically over that period. So the number you plug into that, lately they're putting in, say, a 2% price increase annually. I would argue that it's going to be much more. So, well, if you're plugging in 2%, you're going to get different numbers than if you're plugging in 5% or 1%. So there's, that old quote from Mark Twain about lies, damn lies, statistics. You can make these numbers be whatever you want them to be. So that's going to be a problem as well. But one thing, and I guess maybe we should raise that because you guys do get a lot of questions at SOPEC. What Jimmy was just saying, and maybe Jimmy, what you should say about the lead time on solar panels right now that you're experiencing in Ohio.
Yeah, he's in a meeting right now.
Oh, okay, yeah, okay. So,
Yeah.
yeah. Anyway, he was just saying that all the distributors are going. We got no panels. We got no microinverters. There's
They're
there's
months
months.
back.
How many months?
Months. They just said months away, a
Yeah.
few months. Yeah.
Yeah, so anything that's geared towards the residential marketplace, it's gone because everybody decided, okay, we've got until the end of the year. Well, the way AEP and these other companies are being, they're dragging their feet as long as they possibly can on permission to operate. So if you're saying I'm going to be done by the end of the year, that basically means you're done by the end of October. And if you're going to be done by the end of October, because you got to give 2 months for AEP to say, oh, you didn't put your middle initial on your application, so you've got to resubmit it. And now you're going to have another 30-day wait, which is what they do. And so then you're really going, okay, well, I've got to be done by the end of October. That means I got to be started by, at least the beginning of October, make sure I got all my material, which basically means I got to order it now. And that's what everybody did. So good luck. Good luck getting anything installed at the moment. Jimmy was saying that they do have commercial size panels, right? That's what I heard him say, which may not help you in a residential situation. If you're dealing with 450 watt panels or bigger, you're not going to be using an IQ 8 Plus, which only outputs 290, which sort of gets me to my next topic. Since let's talk a little bit about clipping. So clipping is another term that some folks are not familiar with. And clipping is something that we run into all the time. And if you think about it, normally if I've got, let's say I've got a 10 kW array, that's the size of my array. Well, then what size inverter? So in this case, I've got my array, it's going to a junction box. From the junction box, it's coming up here to a DC disconnect. And then that DC disconnect is connected to my inverter. And this is a string inverter system. And then from the string inverter, we're going to go to typically an AC disconnect. That's got to be located, chapter 5, got to be located within 10 feet of the meter, externally operable, lockable, clearly marked, right? The utility wants to see that AC disconnect out there next to the meter. And then from there, you're going to go, and let's assume it's a load side connection. We're going to connect into a double pole breaker on our service panel. And then that service panel connects to the meter. And then from the meter, of course, you're going out to the grid, to that handy little transformer up on the pole. All right, so that's a typical string inverter system. Well, we've sized our array and we've decided it's 10 kW. What size inverter do we need? Okay, well, logic would tell you I need a 10 kW inverter, right? Because all the power that's coming from the array is going through that inverter, and it's going either to the load, or if it's not needed at the load, it's going out there to the grid. So 100% of whatever the array is producing is always going to be going through the inverter. Make sense, right? Because if it's designed to produce 10 kilowatts at any second under standard test conditions, it may actually produce more, but let's just logically, you would go, okay, I need a 10 kW inverter, minimum. Okay, I could always go bigger. I could put a 13 or kW inverter out there, no problem. It's not going to cause any problems at all. But I may be spending money I don't need to spend. So that's the issue. A lot of times if you ask, can you do something? As we're discussing these things, it may occur to you, hey, can I put in a bigger thing? Can I put in there? Can I do that? The answer is almost always yes, but can you do it affordably? Can you do it economically? That's the big issue. That's why, I don't know, when the data bros start talking about I'm going to do nuclear or whatever, and I always think, why? Yeah, you can do it, but do you really want to pay 3 or 4 times as much as you can get, just doing solar? So I'm going to clear the page here, and let me just show you the concept of clipping. So it's easier to demonstrate if I talk about a microinverter, numbers that are a little easier to deal with. So let's assume this is your curve, and this is going to be watts, and this is time, and it's over the course of a day. And let's say we've got a solar panel, and it's a 350 watt solar panel. So as dawn comes, that panel is going to start producing some energy, and it's going to increase on a clear day. And when it gets to the top, which is solar noon, it's going to be at its maximum or its zenith. And so that's going to be the maximum amount of power that panel produced. I said it was a 350 watt panel. So let's just assume that's 350 watts. So we've got a perfect STC day, which is 1,000 watts per square meter, 25 degrees Celsius, 1.5 atmospheres. All right, so this is going to be 350 watts. So if I have a 350 watt inverter, it's going to go like this. It's going to be capable of producing 350 watts all day long. Now, it is. Everything's good. And this is logically what you would anticipate would happen. But what would happen if I decided I'm going to, instead of having a 350 watt inverter and a 350 watt panel, I'm going to put in a 400 watt panel. Well, then the curve is going to look something like this. And it's going to exceed that output, and then it's going to come down and it's going to zero out again. So you're going to get a number that looks something like that. And this would be your 400 watt panel. All right. Well, at first glance, you can see the inverter is not capable of producing more than 350 watts. So that part of the production is clipped. That's why we call this clipping. It's just not happening. So the inverter is going to go up to 350, but then it's going to flatline at 350. And then as it falls, so you just lost power. And initially you might go, well, that doesn't make any sense. That's really a bad idea. I'm losing power. But notice also at the same moment, you're gaining all of this power by having the bigger panels. So you may actually come out ahead over the course of a day. You may actually be generating more power by putting a 400 watt panel versus a 350. So that's good news. But then you could come back and counter and say, well, I'm paying more for that 400 watt panel than I would for the 350. So even though I come out slightly ahead, what's the reason for this? Well, the reality is there are very few perfect STC days, right? Most of the days you're going to see jagged lines as sun comes out and storms and whatever and clouds, and that's going to be your production. Even on a clear day, if it's really hot, it may be down like that. So it's only those rare, say 5% of the days out of the year that you're actually going to lose power by having a bigger array versus the inverter. But over time, you're going to make a lot more power if you have an oversized or an undersized inverter compared to this. So you're oversizing the array for the inverter. And in today's world, with the pricing of things, the cost of solar panels versus the cost of inverters, it makes economic sense to oversize your array in comparison to your inverter. So how much do we oversize it? Today's market, it's usually going to be in the neighborhood of 1.2 to 1.3, somewhere in there. That's going to be your inverter load ratio, or that's going to be your clipping ratio, if you want to use that term. So if in this example, if we had a 400 watt panel and a 350 inverter, well, 400 divided by 350, let's see what that's going to be. Divided by 350. That's did I do it 1.14? Is that right? Yeah, 1.14. So in that case, that's pretty good. What you may find normally, and the 350 is a little bit absurd. I don't know. Is that what the IQ-A is? The 8A, is that a 350 output? I think it might be. But the traditional IQ8 Plus microinverter is going to be 290 watts. So what we run into a lot is a 290 watt inverter with, say, a 350 watt panel. That works out nicely. And it may be also just the way that pricing is, a 400 watt panel versus a 350 watt panel, they may be the same price. That 400 watt may be on sale or something like that. Or we're dealing with a world right now, Jimmy was saying, where he can't go out there and buy any panels less than 440 watts. Well, at that point, then you just go, well, okay, let's look at that ratio. Is that too much? 440 watts, 440 divided by 290, Now we're getting into a 1.5. That's a pretty hefty clipping ratio. But you'll also have to look up and see what is the maximum watts that microinverter can handle, because 440 may exceed it. I don't have that from memory. But if you look at your IQ8 Plus microinverter, it will say the range that it will handle. Let's just say, yeah, let's look at it and just see. If I go to my screen, is this the one? Yeah, get out of PV Watts and just say IQ8 spec sheet. Well, I clicked on the picture. Here it is. All right, this one's making it tough for me to see. All right, what's the, okay, IQ8 Plus? Yeah, 235 to 440. So with the IQ8 Plus, that's what it'll handle. It'll handle a 235 to a 440. If you get up there to the IQ A 8A, that goes 295 to 500. So you can buy that. It's a commercial grade microinverter, and I know that might be what you have to use in today's market, just because you can't get the residential. It doesn't. There's nothing wrong with putting an IQ8A on your residential home. It's just that you're going to be putting bigger panels up there, and that may or may not be easy to do on a specific roof, because they obviously take up more space. All right, so those are just some of the things back and forth as you start to look at it. So let me jump back into the whiteboard. Any questions about clipping? Because clipping is a concept. It's important to get to know, to understand it. Hopefully it's not overly confusing, but then the last thing, real quick, because we're going to be running out of time here, is I wanted to touch on maximum and minimum string length. And this is one that really confuses people. Well, when I hook up a solar array in a string, remember what happens when you hook it up in a string, which is a series connection, is voltage increases and amps remain the same, right? So if I've got a solar panel, let's say I've got a solar panel with a VOC of 35.8 volts, just say VOC. If I'm hooking them together, if I hook two together, now it's potential of 71.6, and three of them is going to be a little over 100, and so on and so forth. Well, what is my limitation? Well, the limitation is the NEC says that for residential, you can't exceed 600 volts, right? So I don't want my string to exceed 600 volts. Now, there's a secondary limitation, which is if I'm hooking it up to a string inverter, what is the maximum that inverter can handle? Now, most residential string inverters are going to be around 600 volts, but not always. Not always. Sometimes you'll find one that's rated at 550 or 500. They're not going to be more than 600, but they might be less. So let's assume we're dealing with 600 volts. Well, it would be very easy to just say, okay, well, let's take 600 and divide it by 35.8, and I get a number, right? So if I go 600 divided by 35.8, and VOC we're using because it's the worst case scenario, and I end up at 16.75 or 76. All right, so I'd round down and I'd say 16 max. So I can't hook up more than 16 panels in a string without exceeding 600 volts. Well, that would be pretty straightforward. The problem is temperature affects voltage. So how much does it affect voltage? Well, on your panel spec, there's going to be a thing called temperature coefficient at VOC, which basically is how much does that panel's voltage vary for every degree Celsius. And you're going to see a number that's something like 0.4% per degree Celsius. So what that's saying is this particular panel, for every degree less than 25, it's going to increase the voltage by 0.4%. For every degree more than 25, which is standard test conditions temperature, it's going to decrease the voltage by 0.4%. It's very linear that way. So now I say, all right, so I've got to adjust for temperature. How do I adjust for temperature? Well, we're trying to figure out the maximum. So I'll just say, all right, what's the coldest temperature that place has ever experienced? So you look it up on the internet, and let's say we're talking about Athens, Ohio, and I'm just guessing here, but let's say that Athens, Ohio, the coldest that it's ever experienced is minus 35 degrees Celsius. Okay, that's pretty cold, but it's not out of the realm of possibility. So minus 35, well, what's the difference? What's the delta between minus 35 and plus 25? Well, 35 and 25 is going to give us, there's a delta of 60 degrees Celsius. 60 degrees Celsius, okay, so there's 60 degrees less. For every degree less, the temperature coefficient is 0.4% per degree Celsius. So 60 times 0.4 is going to be 24. So 24%. So basically what this is saying is that this panel will produce 24% more voltage on the coldest day ever. More voltage than what? VOC. So I take 35.8 volts times 1.24, that's 124%. And now I'm going to get 35.8 times 1.24 gives me 44.39. 44.39 volts. So on the coldest day ever, if the temperature was minus 35 degrees, that panel would not be producing 35.8 worst case scenario. It's producing 44.39 because voltage goes up when the temperature goes down. So now I take my 600 volts, I divide it by 44.39, and I get a different number, right? 600 divided by 44.39. And now I'm getting 13.51. We always round down because we don't want to exceed. So in this case, it's going to be 13 panels maximum. All right. Does that make sense? That's logically, you're just saying, I would take the worst case voltage, which is VOC. I would divide that into the maximum voltage that my inverter can handle. And that would tell me how many panels I can hook up in a string before I exceed the voltage that the inverter can handle. Except voltage is temperature dependent. So in that case, we have to then adjust how much the voltage would be on the coldest day ever experienced at that location. And then I divide it into my inverter's capacity. Okay. Now, if we're talking about minimum, we just do the backwards, the opposite. We say, okay, what's the hottest temperature this place has ever experienced? I take my temperature coefficient and I would multiply it and I would find out how much less voltage it'll produce on the hottest day. And then instead of using VOC, I would use VMP because I don't want to exceed on the high end. I want to be what's the real number. And then instead of using the maximum voltage that the inverter can produce, I would use its startup voltage. And it might be 150 volts, it might be 100 volts, it might be 80 volts, whatever. And I just say, on the hottest day ever, what's the minimum amount of voltage I can get that will start my inverter? Because if I have too few panels in the string, on a hot day, it might be exactly the same as just like nighttime. That inverter never kicks on because it never receives enough voltage. So you need to know the minimum. And very common in today's world, you're going to be dealing with like a number around 11, 12, 13 max and 4, 5, 6 somewhere in there minimum. So your numbers are going to be somewhere between, say, 6 and 13 is the size of the string for a grid tied system, string inverter. Okay, so I know I went over that really quickly, but at least that should, let's see. That should give you a sense of it when you're looking in the book, what we're trying to accomplish, which is basically when you hook panels together in a string, you increase the voltage of the panel. The voltage of the panel will be VOC. That's going to be the number that we're going to use if temperature was 25 degrees Celsius. But voltage is temperature sensitive, so the colder it gets, the more the voltage. So let's just make sure that on the coldest day ever, that string does not exceed the voltage tolerance of your inverter. It's all we're trying to do. So, and then on the hottest day ever, we want to make sure that string is going to generate enough power to turn on the machine. So that's also all we're trying to do. One other factor, and you'll see this in the book, is when you're dealing with the hottest day ever, you got to add, because if you're on the roof, it's hotter than the ambient air temperature. So if you're up there on the roof and you're doing a flush to roof system, you have to add 35 degrees Celsius to that calculation of what is the hottest day. If it's a ballasted system, you're going to add 30 degrees. And if it's a ground mounted system, you're going to add 25. So all we're doing is just, again, adjusting the temperature of your array versus ambient air temperature. We don't have to make a similar adjustment for cold temperature, because when it's cold, it's just going to be cold, you know. But when it's hot, if you've worked on a roof, it's a lot hotter than the ambient air temperature. So, okay, we come to the end of the hour. So any questions before we call it a day here? Okay, so I'll see you again next Tuesday, same time from jolly old England. All right, so take care. See you guys later.
Hey, enjoy
Thanks,
Wednesday.
Jay.
Bye-bye.
Enjoy the trip.